Hi, YouTube. My name is Jack. It is Sunday night. I've just been out frolicking in the snow, and while I was frolicking, I was forming some thoughts about the nature of tradition. So I want to sit down and share those thoughts with you here. So today we're going to talk about the concept of tradition as it exists in Wicca, and then sort of more broadly, this spills over into witchcraft, neo-paganism, occultism, sort of those overlapping spaces, although a lot of where I'm coming from is coming from thinking about Wicca and Gardnerian Wicca more specifically. Um, and really, I have three questions that sort of define the way I'm thinking about tradition in this video. The first is, what is tradition in the first place? Not necessarily a specific tradition, right? The Gardnerian tradition of Wicca, or, the tradition of having grandma's meatloaf at Christmas every year. But what is tradition more broadly? How do we define tradition in a way that's meaningful and useful for us? Secondly, why does tradition matter? Why is it a thing worth valuing, and is it worth valuing at all? Spoiler alert, I think it's worth valuing because I'm in a branch of Wicca that defines itself, is oriented around a concept of tradition. So tradition is a thing that matters a great deal to me. That's part of why I sought out Gardnerian Wicca. But nonetheless, thinking about what the value of tradition is, where that value comes from, I think is important because otherwise we sort of get lost in the woods with things being traditional because they're valuable and valuable because they're traditional, and then it's all sort of circular and our heads explode. And then thirdly, I'd like to explore a little bit of why people get so weird about tradition. Because people do, right? People get very defensive if they feel like you are threatening or trying to change or undermine any of their traditions, both in a religious context and in sort of an ordinary, mundane traditional context, right? Like, try telling someone that you're not going to have their grandma's meatloaf at Christmas dinner and just see how that conversation goes. But then there are also all sorts of other weird things that happen around the concept of tradition. There are some people who sort of flagrantly stand against the concept of tradition, think it's no good, want to do away with anything that's seen as traditional just for the sake of doing away with it. There are people who really want to define or create their own traditions, who want to sort of create things and then pass them off as traditional. And I mean, that's a thing that's been going on, certainly sort of for all of human history, but in the context of witchcraft, that's been going on since Gardner's time. Doreen Valiente has all kinds of anecdotes about meeting someone and seeing that they were, they would show her their Book of Shadows or whatever, and they'd be like, this is an ancient spell that has been passed down in my family for 16 generations. And it would be something that she herself had written that got out into the wider pagan community, and someone decided to stick it in their Book of Shadows and call it traditional. So why do people make up traditions? Why do people care about that? And, also, like, how do things become traditional so quickly, right? Like, it turns out that grandma was the one who started doing meatloaf on Christmas dinner, and no one before grandma ever did meatloaf on Christmas dinner. But as soon as she introduced it, it became tradition, and now it's unthinkable for anyone to do anything else for Christmas dinner. And why is that? So this is sort of the array of things that I've been thinking over while I have been frolicking in the snow. And to start with, let's talk a little bit about defining tradition. This is a really slippery concept, and we're not going to get a clean definition off of it. We're not going to get what philosophers like to call a real definition, which is a set of conditions that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient for a thing to count as, in this case, tradition. Right? So we're not going to get a perfect definition where everything that fits that is tradition and everything that doesn't fit that is not tradition. There are going to be fringe cases always. And that's just sort of the nature of, right, tradition is a human thing. And human things, cultural constructs, whatever you want to talk about, are slippy. They evade precise definition because they change depending on people and social contexts and cultures and all kinds of things. But so there are a handful of definitions that people throw out sometimes. There are three in particular that I think are useful but imperfect for framing this conversation about tradition. The first one is, it's a quote by someone real famous, and off the top of my head, I can't remember. I should have Googled it before I started this video, but there's a quote that people like to throw around, that tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. So this idea that tradition means the continuation of a living practice that will perhaps change and grow and evolve alongside the people who practice it, but that is in some way meaningfully connected to the past, right? It's not that you're dousing your fire and rebuilding it every day, you're keeping the fire alive by adding new wood to it or whatever. And this is a thing that people really like to bring out when they're talking about tradition, and in particular when they're talking about trying to get their heads around the way that evolution can be a feature of tradition, the way that traditions can change, and the change can be a part of the tradition itself. The fact of change, rather, can be a part of the tradition itself. That's one thing that people like to say about tradition. The second definition I like is not actually about tradition, it's about conservatism, but it's an Oscar Wilde quote, and I just think it's great. And that is, a conservative is a person who believes there should never be a first time for anything. There's a sense in which when we talk about tradition, particularly sort of in this religious context, tradition often means we're going to do it the way that we did it before. We're going to do it the way that it's always been done, or even just the way that, like, my mom did it, or whatever. But we're not going to do it the new way when the old way is already there. There's a sort of privileging or preference for things that are established, things that are precedented, things that have been done before, and there should never be a first time for anything. And so rather, sort of in opposition to the preservation of fire quote, the never a first time for anything quote emphasizes the branch of tradition, sort of as the concept exists, that is more conservative, more rigid, more focused on keeping things the way that they are and not allowing evolution, change, growth, whatever you want to call it. And the third thing that I like is it's a quote by, it's not even a quote, it's a paraphrase of a thing that Twyla Tharp said. Twyla Tharp, very famous choreographer, and she was talking about ritual, not about tradition. But Twyla Tharp, in one of her books, says, ritual is a set of decisions that have already been made so they don't have to be made again. So she talks about this in the context of choreography, right? She wakes up at the same time every day, puts on the same clothes, takes the same route to work, gets the same cup of coffee at the same place, and all of those decisions are already made for her, so she doesn't have to expend energy on reinventing the universe every time she wakes up and walks to work. And she can save her creative energy for the places where it matters when she's doing the creative work of choreography. And so there's a sense in which that, to me, really resonates with the idea of tradition more broadly. The idea that, look, there are decisions that are already made for us, that we don't have to figure out, that we don't have to reinvent, we don't have to make these decisions again, because the path has been cleared, right? You can bushwhack your way through the forest, or you can take this path that's already been laid out for you, and you're going to get to where you're going a lot faster, right? One of the advantages of tradition, sort of tradition in a religious context, is if you're trying to achieve a particular result, whether that is a feeling of religious ecstasy or whether that's a particular magical result, if you have a set of techniques that have been proven efficacious in getting that result, if you have a set of things that a lot of people have done before and it's worked, then you can do that and you know you're going to get to where you're going. You don't have to sort of stumble around, like I say, whacking your way through the woods. And so that's a thing that I think is helpful to keep in mind, is this idea of tradition not as a thing that stands for its own sake, but as a thing that helps us to achieve a result. So those are the three ideas about what tradition is that I'm drawing from other people. And now I'm going to give you my own definition of tradition, which is imperfect, but it's the best one that I was able to think of while I was playing in the snow. So for the rest of our conversation here, tradition is going to be defined as a set of practices that collectively serve as a bridge between the personal and the transpersonal by means of a real or imagined historical provenance. So let's break that down a little bit. When I say a set of practices, I don't mean a rigidly defined set of practices. I sort of mean a loose bundle of them where, like, you know, I might have A, B, C, D, E, you might have A, B, C, D, F, but we might still sort of consider ourselves to be doing the same tradition or engaging in the same set of practices. And likewise, someone else might have B, C, D, F, G, but we're sort of all in the same territory. And when I say bridging between the personal and the transpersonal, that's a little bit of sort of jargony talk. Really what I'm saying is it connects you as an individual to something larger than yourself. Whether that's a feeling of divine religious ecstasy and communion with deity, whether that's a feeling of connection to a larger religious community, but something, it serves a purpose that puts you outside of yourself, connects you to something that is bigger than you. And lastly, it does this by means of a historical provenance. It's rooted in the past somehow. It's rooted in people who have come before you, whether that's a family tradition, whether that's a religious lineage, whether that's a sort of a broad cultural tradition. And importantly, I think that historical provenance doesn't necessarily have to be real, as long as it's part of the story. If there's a story that we do this thing because 10,000 years ago, witches in caves worshiping, the god of the hunt did things this way, and so we're reconnecting to them, that serves the same sort of purpose in that it provides that bridge between you and something larger than yourself, even if we have archaeological evidence to show that there were no witches in caves doing this exact thing 10,000 years ago. So there's my definition of tradition for you. People get in all kinds of fights about tradition, and no one ever wants to define what tradition itself really is. People might want to define the details of specific traditions, right? In the Gardnerian tradition, we do XYZ. In the Alexandrian tradition, we do ABC. But just tradition more generally is a really difficult thing to define, and a lot of the time people just sort of skip over defining it, which I think is a shame because once we have a working definition, even if it's not a perfect one, even if you don't entirely agree with my definition, now we can talk about tradition in more concrete terms. So we've said what tradition is. The next question is, why is it valuable? And the answer, given the definition that I'm using here, seems obvious. It's valuable because it connects you to something larger than yourself, right? The reason that tradition is good, the reason that tradition is useful, is not because it's old. It's because it provides this connection to something transpersonal, something bigger than the individual. And its being old or its having a historical provenance connects into that because it's sort of the means by which it achieves that end, right? You're connecting to something larger than yourself in the sense that you're hooking yourself into a lineage of people going back however many generations who have all done very similar things to you. And in that way, you're sort of establishing this connection to something larger. But the lineage, the going back, the old part is not the point of it. It's the mechanism. It's the way of achieving the thing that we care about, which is the feeling of connection to something larger. And that's in a religious context that makes perfect sense, right? The connection to something larger, you're connected to your ancestors in the craft, you're connected to your own religious lineage, you're connected to your gods, whatever. But also in a non-religious context, if we think about grandma's meatloaf, right? Like, why does grandma's meatloaf at Christmas dinner matter? Well, because it's a thing that we do in the family, because it makes me feel connected to the family. It makes me remember my family. All right, like even if I'm not having dinner with grandma, we have her meatloaf on the table, and that makes me feel like a part of something bigger than me. It reminds me of my connection to my family. And in that sense, like the fact that no one was doing meatloaf at Christmas dinner before grandma really doesn't matter. How old, how far back the tradition goes, it doesn't matter as much as the effect that the tradition has of connecting me to this bigger thing, which in this case is my family. Because that's what the tradition is there for. That's what the point of tradition is the establishment of that connection to something larger. So there's what tradition is, there's what tradition is valuable for. Why are people so weird about tradition? Why do people get in these bitter fights over tradition? And I think the answer depends on the way in which people are being weird. But I think it comes back to really this notion that I've introduced of a set of practices that bridges the personal and the transpersonal by means of a real or imagined historical provenance. If I feel like you are threatening my tradition, if I feel like you are trying to change my tradition, or if you're trying to undermine my traditions, you come into my house on Christmas Eve and you say, actually, we're not having meatloaf tomorrow, we're going to do turkey instead. Like, what I react to, what makes me feel insecure about that, is that the tradition connects me to something larger than myself. And when I think you're trying to take away my tradition, I think you're trying to take away my connection to that larger thing, right? I feel threatened, and when I say I here, I'm not necessarily referring to myself specifically, I'm sort of talking about a broader phenomenon. When people feel like you're trying to take away their traditions, they feel threatened because they feel like you're trying to take away their connection to something bigger than themselves. They have this thing that bridges the gap between them and the bigger than them. And if you come in and try to knock down that bridge, you might potentially, or you might at least look like you're posing a threat to their connection to that big, important, meaningful thing that is outside of and larger than them. And likewise, if we're in a community and you decide that you're going to innovate and someone goes, hey, you can't do that, that's changing the tradition. If we're, whatever, if we belong to a tradition where you have apples every ritual and you're like, actually, like, I don't really like apples, I'm gonna have oranges, whatever. Someone might go like, hey, you can't do that, that's changing the tradition. Even though you're eating oranges doesn't take away from their ability to eat apples and have their own tradition that connects them to the larger than them in a wonderful way, right? And that's because tradition is understood as, is connected to, as something that's bigger than the individual. Right? This is, I think, really, really important. We understand tradition to be something that is larger than any of us individually. And so there's this feeling that none of us individually have the right to change that tradition whole cloth because it's bigger than you, right? Like, you as a person, you don't have the right to change the thing that connects us to the larger, the transpersonal. Like, who do you think you are? And I think that's part of why people get really defensive about tradition. Even if we're in a situation where, like, I really don't like apples. Apples don't make me feel connected to the larger whole, whatever. Or if we're in a if we're in a situation where, like, we're all still having grandma's meatloaf, and maybe someone is like sprinkling breadcrumbs on the top of it. Minor changes versus major changes. I'm sort of talking in circles here because I'm like talking inside baseball with all the Gardnerians who are watching. For anyone who's watching and doesn't know all of the internal debates that I'm referencing here and is feeling confused, I'm sorry. I like, there are particular things that are on my mind that I'm thinking about and talking around as I have this discussion about tradition more broadly. But the point I want to make, and I'm not making it very well, is that people see a perceived change in tradition as a threat to their own connection to something larger than themselves. And they see anyone attempting to make a change to the tradition, or anyone who they perceive as attempting to make a change to the tradition, as impudent because the tradition connects us to something larger than any individual. And so, in this defensive, reactionary attitude, no individual should have the right to change the thing that gives us that access. And I think that also feeds into why people want to invent traditions so desperately. Because A, we're all starved for a connection to something larger than ourselves, right? Like, we all need that. That's why we do religion. And even outside of religion, that's why we have grandma's meatloaf at Christmas dinner. We all want the connection to something bigger. And if that's not readily available to us, we make it up. But B, I think that people have egos, right? A shocker, right? I have an ego, you have an ego. People like to feel big. And if you invent something, if you contribute something to tradition, if you make something that people after you then go like, oh yes, we have to do it this way because, Jack invented this tradition of having apples at every ritual, and now we have to do apples at every ritual. Um, it makes you feel good about yourself. It makes you feel big. It makes you feel, important because all these other people have taken this thing that I made and like that's their connection to a really big important thing now. And like no one is immune to wanting that kind of an ego trip. It's not necessarily healthy, it's not necessarily good, but I think that part of why people like to invent traditions or sort of create things and then pass them off as traditional is for that ego feeling of like I made something that now is tradition and connects these other people to something larger. The slightly more sympathetic and kinder take on that would be that if I start doing something on my own that feels very deep and meaningful to me, I might think, oh, well, if this is deep and meaningful to me, then it will probably also be deep and meaningful to other people, and I want to share that wonderful, profound experience with all of them, so I'm going to introduce it as part of this larger tradition. I'm going to add it on to the body of practices that connects us to the transpersonal, because if it works for me, then likely it will also work for other people. That's the kinder way to think about it. Um, so I'm rambling, and I know I'm rambling. It's 9:30 at night, and I don't normally make videos at night because I am most coherent when the sun is out. But the main thing I think that I want us to take away from this video, and I promise I'll wrap it up soon because we're over 20 minutes here, is that tradition is complicated. Tradition is weird and slippery and really hard to define. And it matters to a lot of us, right? Like within the context of Gardnerian Wicca, I am fiercely conservative. I have really sort of strong feelings about the ways that I like ritual to be done. It doesn't matter when, I'm not in charge of the ritual because whoever's in charge is the one making the decisions. But like when I do ritual on my own, I have strong feelings about the way that I like ritual to be done, and they're very, very conservative feelings. I don't add a lot of shit. I really just, I like the bare bones sort of basics of Gardnerian Wicca because that's what makes me feel connected to the thing that's larger. Um, so I'm a fiercely conservative traditionalist when it comes to Gardnerian Wicca, but I'm also sort of conscious of the weird nature of this thing that is tradition. Not necessarily one specific tradition, but the concept of tradition. And the way that that gets weaponized sometimes in arguments, right? Like, and even sort of outside of Wicca, if you look at neo-paganism more broadly, tradition can sometimes lead you down a really weird and dark path, and there were neo-Nazis at the end of the path. Um, but just sort of more broadly, like, what is tradition? What is this thing that we all seem to care about so much? And why does it matter to us? And why are we all so weird about it? Um, and this video is me talking through some of my own thoughts on those questions. I don't claim to have the correct answers to those questions. I would really invite, like, if other people have thoughts about this, have a conversation with me. Talk to me about this, because I'm curious. I want to know what you think about this sort of thing. Because I don't have the answers. I have thoughts, I have questions, I don't have answers. And tradition is weird, and yet it matters. Anyway, we're gonna end there because I'm not gonna have anything more productive to say on this. I'm just gonna keep going in circles. Thank you if you have stuck around for all 25 minutes, and I will see you next time. Bye.